We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles McKenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip. When it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
This is episode 399 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Joe Stevenson, the editor of The Dutch Lady. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare and his contemporaries includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In Shakespeare's play, Henry IV, Part 1, Falstaff declares on more than one occasion, "I am a rogue." Several exchanges between Falstaff, Henry V, and others like Hostess Quickly and Doll Tearsheet see characters throwing this word rogue back and forth at each other as both an insult and sometimes a badge of honor. The term connects to a real form of slang underworld language known as rogue cant, which was a secret, cryptic lexicon spoken and understood only by criminals. Falstaff and his companions are the closest depictions of criminals in Shakespeare's works, and their roguish behavior includes gathering at the Boar's Head Inn in Eastcheap to plan their crimes and divide their spoils. By choosing to use the word rogue, Shakespeare was deliberately connecting his characters to the real criminal underworld of the 16th century that trafficked in this mysterious and coded language. To introduce us to this rogue cant and help us unlock the hidden meanings of these words so that we can better understand the culture that produced them, we are excited to welcome Ari Friedlander back to the show. Ari is Associate Professor of English at the University of Mississippi, specializing in Shakespeare, early modern drama, and the history of class, sexuality, gender, race, and disability. His research explores how marginalized figures like rogues, vagrants, and outsiders shaped Renaissance literature and culture. He's the author of Rogue Sexuality in Early Modern English Literature, Desire Status, Biopolitics, which examines how literary portrayals of rogues and vagrants intersected with larger social anxieties and linguistic practices, including canting language, which is what he joins us today to take a closer look at. We're going to explore where the words came from, how they were used, and what they reveal about Shakespeare's life. Before we dive into today's conversation, remember that you can follow along with the history we're discussing today through our detailed show notes. These are bonus visual extras available for patrons of That Shakespeare Life, and this week's extras include excerpts from Deckers and Green's pamphlets, woodcuts from the 1500s that depict rogue cant being used, along with a copy of a 1586 publication that claimed to have interviewed vagabonds and outlined their language of curses. These and more primary documents, along with museum artifacts related to rogues, vagabonds, and their language, are available to view while you listen to the show today by clicking Access the Extras on our episode page at CassidyCash.com/episode 399. That's CassidyCash.com/EP399. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Ari. Welcome back to That Shakespeare Life. It's really nice to have you here today.
It's wonderful to be back, Cassidy. Thank you for inviting me back on the channel.
If we're hearing the phrase rogue cant for the first time here today, is this phrase referring to specific words, or is it like a category of words? I think about the phrase curse words, for example, and other vulgarities. Or was rogue cant a fully formed alternative language?
Rogue cant was more of what linguists call a cryptolect, which is like a secret language or sometimes a vocabulary used by a particular subcultural or social group. And cant, I would say, falls into the vocabulary side of things more than the language. It doesn't have its own grammar. It's not really, you can't really speak it on its own. You have to be speaking English while you're using it. But it was used by vagrants and criminals potentially to hide their criminal misdeeds. So I think it's different than curse words, right? It's a little bit more similar to a language in that sense. It's communicative in a sort of specialized way, but it is not like a curse word exactly. On the other hand, like because some people knew what these words meant, there were some, as we'll talk about later, I think there were some handbooks and manuals and things like that were published eventually. Using cant could eventually, once people recognize these words, be seen as a kind of vulgarity, like a curse word in that sense, right?
Just by association.
Exactly, right?
Who's using this?
And right. I mean, association with the lower classes and the underclass always has the potential to be impolite. In fact, a lot of our words for politeness mean uncouth or lower class, right? Like unseemly or something like that. So just the fact that association was there, as you say, made them kind of improper for polite society. But of course, as with curse words, sometimes people in polite society you like to use that to be roguish or to be outre or what have you, right? So it could give these words a certain appeal, and even in polite circles, just like the F word or something like that, right?
I'm going to draw kind of a fine line of distinction here, but I'd like you to explain for us how rogue cant was applied in practical use. Was it strictly a coded language where you're using this to hide your criminal activity, or was it something closer to what I think of as the Romany language, where rogue cant might have been used as a part of a cultural identity, or even certain groups of society that owned this kind of language and said, this is how we speak on purpose?
Right. That's a great question. As I said earlier, it's not a real language the way Romany is. Of course, Romany itself is not strictly associated with crime in this period because all Romany was used in all sorts of contexts by the Roma people or the Romani people. I would say that in practical use, it's a hard question to answer because it's also difficult to say whether and to what extent early modern criminals really used this slang for the purpose of hiding criminal activity, right? We don't have any kind of way to read their intent, right? It could have mainly been used simply because they existed in a certain subculture that organically develops its own slang, the same way, Gen Alpha is developing its own slang now, right? In both cases, like some people overhearing it, the slang has the virtue of secrecy, right? But it's not necessarily developed and always used for that purpose. At the same time, the question of secrecy can also make it more suspicious and be less of a virtue and something of a risk for that language. But I think you're right that Shakespeare's culture, maybe Shakespeare himself, would have made little distinction between Romany and Thieves cant, because the culture itself didn't make the same distinction between the Roma and criminals that, of course, we make today, right? In Thomas Decker's Lantern and Candlelight, published in 1608, which was a popular prose pamphlet about London crime, the Roma are described as what we might call a subtype of criminal in a kind of criminal taxonomy. And they are given the name moon men to describe like their vagrant mobile status, right? The moon wanders and it changes, right? And it's maybe untrustworthy, associated with lunacy and craziness, as the word lunacy suggests. So, Dekker is painting with a pretty broad racist brush there. And so it makes sense for readers of Shakespeare and other writers in this culture to think about that association as, of course, contemporary to that time period. Although today, historians and linguists are going to distinguish these languages and are going to distinguish Roma people from criminals, Shakespeare's contemporaries most usually definitely did not.
Well, where did rogue cant start officially? I mean, why is it associated with criminal activity?
No one really knows for sure where it began. I mean, by nature of the people who were using it, right? It wasn't that nobody was documenting the birth of this language. So we don't really know for sure. We certainly know it goes back as far as the medieval France or Italy, where they used Old Provençal, which is a sort of medieval French, Italian, Latin style language. There's a phrase there called jargon vulgare or vulgare trutanorum, which means jargon is thieves' language. And indeed, the French word jargon comes from that Provençal word jargon, and our English loanword jargon comes from that word also. So the whole idea of a kind of language, specialized language that is encoded in that word jargon, originates with the idea of rogue thieves can't, right? Which is kind of interesting to think about. It's like the original jargon. The version Shakespeare was familiar with in the 16th century and 17th century in English was popularized by a different set of texts, Renaissance texts that I alluded to earlier by people like Thomas Dekker and Robert Greene. Those were contemporaries of Shakespeare's and playwrights and pamphleteers. They were working off of work by this guy named Thomas Harmon, who was an earlier mid-16th century author. And all those texts sort of describe rogues as a thriving and dangerous subculture in early modern England. They had like a kind of inverted hierarchical version of early modern society. Of course, part of that inverted sort of equal and opposite society was, for them, an equal and opposite language, right? And so cant was represented here often as a kind of perverted almost language that was used, as you say earlier, or you hinted at earlier, to shroud the ill intent of evildoers. But, these are sensationalist sources. They're sort of like the National Enquirer of their day almost. And you wouldn't necessarily want to put stock in everything they say about their subject. So, like I said, it's kind of hard to say whether it was really so pointed a motive in using it. And if you allow me a little bit of a longer answer on this question, I would say that to me, one of the most interesting things about your question is that early modern England was itself kind of obsessed with the origins of rogues and of their language. And in the book I published in 2022, and whose soft cover just came out this summer, I talk about one particularly long account of the origin of rogue literature. I'm not going to go into all of it here, but I will, to make a long story short, Thomas Dekker implies that thieves' cant is as old as language itself, originating out of the confusion of languages that were generated in the aftermath of the mythical events of the biblical Tower of Babel story. And so just like the word jargon is sort of like and our idea of the jargon language comes from thieves' cant in a way, Dekker sees like all of language and thieves' cant sort of being born together. The question of origins, is a really interesting one.
Well, we've defined rogue cant as this secret underworld language. And we've also mentioned that playwrights like Dekker are using it in their plays, which begs the question, how did they learn about it? If this is a language that's being used by a subculture and it's supposed to be this secret hidden thing, where are they getting their information? And how is it useful on the stage if the audience isn't supposed to know what it is?
Right. Well, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, it cannot possibly be very useful on stage if nobody knows what it is, right? So there was a sort of awareness of it as a secret language, if that makes sense. And in the 16th century, these people I mentioned before, the writers of rogue literature, their works are very popular. They go into multiple editions. Harmon's work is plagiarized by Greene and by Dekker and others. And so playwrights are certainly reading these texts. And in fact, Greene and Dekker are playwrights also who are working during Shakespeare's time, right? Greene is the famous playwright and prose writer who accused Shakespeare of being an upstart crow. Greene himself seems to have seen Shakespeare as a kind of rogue. These texts, these ideas about this kind of language, they're circulating quite vividly. They make quite an impression among Shakespeare's set. But I would say that, like I said, that doesn't mean that everybody knew everything about them, right? I think that often if a playwright is using this kind of language, they might be using it in the same way that the writers of the crime pamphlets are using them, in the sense that it makes them seem like they have their ear to the ground, or they're in the know about like what the dark nooks and crannies of the culture is really like, right? So you might watch an episode of Law and Order that is talking about something going on the internet, right? That you don't really know about, but you've heard something about, you got a news alert or something, right? So people know about it, but you don't, but when you watch the episode of Law and Order, you're like, oh, those writers, they really got into this and they're explaining what this is all about, right? And so I think that playwrights could use this in a similar kind of way, use rogue cant in a similar kind of way to seem fashionable, or it might strike you as novel if you know nothing about it, in which case it seems sort of educational, right? Or it might strike you as fashionable if you were already in the know and you're sort of approving of you as the reader for getting the joke, right? Or you as the audience member for getting the joke.
We see the word rogue several times in Shakespeare's plays, especially related to Falstaff, who's constantly declaring that he is a rogue. But we see his group of less than savory individuals throwing this word around. But I wonder if Shakespeare's plays ever actually use rogue cant as part of the dialogue. Are there rogue cant phrases in Shakespeare's plays?
Yes, absolutely. Shakespeare uses rogue cant in several of his plays, so we know he is familiar with it, including the history plays you mentioned in your introduction, but also The Merry Wives of Windsor. Of course, Falstaff is in that play too, so de rigueur, that rogue cant comes up there, and The Winter's Tale, which famously has the rogue Autolycus in it. So it sort of Shakespeare, you can tell from these examples, right, that Shakespeare is using it at a kind of it's seemingly to add a kind of authenticity or sharpness to vividness to the characters that are drawn from that sector of society. At the same time, Shakespeare doesn't really seem interested in staging long rogue cant conversations like some of his contemporaries and the people who came after him were interested in doing. He seems less interested in explaining what these terms mean, less interested in the kind of way that some of these other playwrights almost offer like a language lesson sometimes. Shakespeare is much more interested, it seems, in just throwing in some rogue cant for flavor or something. So, for example, in the history plays, Falstaff's companion and Prince Hal's companion Poins refers to Bardolph, another of their group, as quote unquote our setter, which was a rogue term that meant somebody who sets up a scheme or a victim, like in a confidence scheme in a bar or something like that, a tavern. But the conversation between Poins and Bardolph is not conducted entirely in Thieves' Cant or anything like that, right? And The Winter's Tale similarly has Autolycus come on and give this wonderful speech about all his terrible misdeeds, and it's very charming, but it's not all in Thieves' Cant. But he does have words like dells and doxies, which were terms from rogue cant for young girls and women, so suggesting the kind of sexual misdeeds of Autolycus with these rogue women, right? So there's a kind of flair that Shakespeare adds to these depictions of the underworld, but it's restrained compared to a lot of his contemporaries. I think even if you look at other use of dialect in Shakespeare, it's very restrained, right? I mean, you look at the national or regional dialects in something like Henry V are much more consistent and ubiquitous. And even if you're looking at like sort of language games with schoolboy Latin, right, in something like Love's Labour's Lost or As You Like It, it seems like a much more sustained investment in those kinds of linguistic games than he has in Cant. So Shakespeare does seem very interested in rogues, but he seems less interested in rogue language than he does in other kinds of subcultural linguistic dialects, at least to my mind.
If you're enjoying learning about rogue cant and you would like to see some of the visual history related to this topic, we have tons of extras packed into our research vault for this week's show. You can see a woodcut from 1500 that claims to be the earliest example of rogue cant, along with period documents that use rogue cant, like Thomas Decker's The Bellman of London from 1608, along with a document that was published in 1566 that warns people about using rogue cant phrases. That document was so popular, 2 men were punished for publishing unlicensed copies. From museum artifacts to primary documents and more, there's tons of extra history to explore about rogue cant while you listen to the show. Access these extras inside That Shakespeare Society when you click Become a Member on our episode page this week at CassidyCash.com/episode 399. That's CassidyCash.com/EP399. Well, give us a little bit of a rogue cant language lesson here, if you will. I think there's uses of rogue cant from popular early modern plays like The Roaring Girl by Middleton and Dekker, as well as The Beggar's Bush by Beaumont and Fletcher and Massinger. Give us some examples of how these authors are using rogue cant in their works.
Yeah, I love these examples you chose because they really show us 2 very different but central ways that Shakespeare's contemporaries are using Thieves' Cant. In The Roaring Girl, which is a London city comedy, that you have these urban sort of con artists and thieves and ne'er-do-wells that are depicted as speaking in Thieves' Cant as sort of like part of what signals their thievish identity on stage. But I think more interestingly, what's striking about the use of cant in that play is the way the urban elites in the play are super enthusiastic to learn the slang when they hear the rogues using it. And they demand language lessons so that they can be extra hip and edgy, right? One of the characters, he's depicted as spending an hour in the market trying to decide what feather to buy to put in his cap, right? That's how much fashion matters to him. And then later on, when he hears the rogue language, he wants to collect that language and show it off in the same way as he would the sort of perfect feather, right? In this case, the joke is sort of on him in that play. They're satirizing that kind of urban fop. And he hears a rogue using the word niggling, which means having sex. And he says, "What is niggling? I would fain be niggling," right? And he doesn't realize he's saying, "What is sex? I really would like to be having sex," right? And so the joke's on him, right? But the ironic thing is that the joke requires the audience to know what niggling means, right? And so this exchange only makes sense if playwrights expect their audiences to know what these terms mean in order to get the joke, right? So it sort of shows how these languages are both sort of secret and not, what you might call like an open secret. In Beggar's Bush, we have a setting, a country or rural setting that's more like Robin Hood. You know, your listeners might think about that context with bands of beggars or thieves in the woods. And like other plays in the period, including The Spanish Gypsy by Heywood and A Jovial Crew by Richard Broome. Richard Broome's 1641, so a little bit later, but The Spanish Gypsy is right in there in 1620s. These plays feature like more lighthearted depictions of rogues who are more or less having parties with drinking and dancing and singing, like you would imagine Robin Hood's, right? It's important that Robin Hood's group is called the Merry Men. There's this romanticization of bands of thieves in the forest having a good time. And so the cant in these places is often a part of these festivities. And there are longer exchanges and songs in which it also doesn't matter if the audience understands it, because the intention is to portray like a festive look into like a fun secret society, right? So you might even get more out of those scenes if you don't know what cant is, right? Because you experience it as this fun sort of secret group.
I was looking up as you were explaining the joke in The Roaring Girl, but yes, it is Jack Dapper that says that line.
Okay,
and
excellent.
Some contemporaries of Shakespeare, like Thomas Harmon in 1566 and Robert Greene in 1591, they went through and attempted to catalog this rogue cant language, which I just think is an impressive, ambitious goal there. Thomas Harmon even claimed to have interviewed what he called vagabonds for the purpose of learning about this language. What can you tell us about these projects, and were they successful? I mean, and were there real criminals signing on to say, "Hey, sure, let me explain to you what my secret language is"?
Yes and no. So the rogues cant, like the vocabulary lists there in these books, I'm not a historian, but I believe that we have substantiated that some of those words exist in court records as recorded dialogue or as testimony or what have you. I think that we don't believe these things are completely fabricated. So in that sense, they were successful, right? But I think that the question of how they got their hands on this information might be a little bit more complicated than what someone like Harmon says, where he says, I met this rogue woman and I interviewed her and I'm giving you the facts based on these interviews, right? As if he's like a sociolinguist, which he, of course, was not. He wasn't even a justice of the peace, which he claims to be in his book. Scholarship by a historian named A.L. Beyer has shown that he was never a justice of the peace. I think the best public office he had was something like commissioner of the sewers or something like that, which seems oddly apt for somebody studying the underworld. So he was a liar, right? We can't really take everything he says at face value. But I think that, and of course, Greene and Decker are reading Harmon and basing a lot of what they say on him. But at the same time, Greene and Decker also make claims to either have firsthand knowledge or secondhand knowledge themselves from informants or from their own time spent among this class of people. And if that seems hard for you to believe that Shakespeare's contemporaries in the theater were doing that, or might have even been criminals themselves, I think that it's important to remember, of course, not only were players just one social step above vagabonds in the period, if that, because the statutes against vagabonds named players and musicians as like the same class of vagrant criminals, right? And the statutes against rogues these were all the same statutes, right? They were not only connected to them socially in that way and legally, but we know that Decker was in jail for debt. that Greene had this well-worn reputation as a carouser and a drinker and a frequenter of prostitutes. They really may have been their own informants about rogue language rather than sort of going out and doing sociolinguistics on a rogue underworld that they sort of
as the
floated
song
way above.
says, they definitely had friends in low places. It could have just been a marketing ploy of like,
Right.
oh
Well,
yeah,
I
I
mean,
talked with real criminals, even though I
yeah,
am one.
yeah. Well, I mean, any teacher of any subject is familiar with the student who says, well, my friend cheated on this test, or I have a friend who's doing this thing. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Right.
asking for
So,
a friend. Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
exactly. So there might be some of that going on.
Well, can you give us some examples of rogue cant that we might recognize? You've gone over a couple of examples, but what are some words that we can say when you use this, you are using a word from rogue cant?
As we discussed, roguery has made different kinds of impacts on our language, including the word jargon. But, a word like fence, like somebody who sells and deals in stolen goods, right? That originated in rogue cant from this period, right? It meant back then exactly what we use it to mean today, right? Fence, somebody who sells stolen goods. And the word booze is not directly derived from thieves' cant. I think in the way it's used today, there are other. It made some various, it's a word with a long history, but the word for alehouse in thieves' cant was boozing ken. Ken meant house, and boozing ken meant drinking house. And so I think that there is a sort of, it's part of the genealogy of that word, right? So booze, fence. And then if you're thinking about like words that sort of overlap between like Romani and what we might call criminal slang today, the word shiv, like a prison shiv, right, that you might use to stab, not you, one might use to stab somebody. I'm sure, Cassidy, you would never do that.
I appreciate that.
Comes from the Romani word for knife, which is chiv or shiv. So those are three examples of how you might see what the period might have called thieves' cant, even if, again, today we might want to distinguish between Romani and thieves' cant. What the period might have called thieves' cant survives into our own argot.
If somebody wanted to explore this subject on their own and look into more words from rogue cant and all of the illustrious history that's here, as someone who knows more than most about this part of history, where would you suggest we begin?
So the sort of gold standard reference book on the subject is a volume edited by a scholar named Julie Coleman called A History of Cant and Dictionaries. And it's a multi-volume series, but volume one covers 1567, which is readers of yours or listeners of yours might already recognize as the publication date of Thomas Harmon. Second edition, you reference 1566, the first edition, but we don't actually have a copy of the first edition. So the one we have is from 1567. Although, sorry, I'm getting in the weeds here. But so 1567.
That's an important distinction. If we go looking for 1566 and can't find it, we're going to be confused. So
exactly. So 1567 to 1785. So for anything Shakespearean, that should cover your listeners. And that's published by Oxford in 2004. And then another reference book that your listeners might be interested in is Romani, A Linguistic Introduction by Yaron Matras, published by Cambridge in 2002. And for the more literary side of things, there's a wonderful chapter by a scholar named Paula Blank in her monograph, in her book, Broken English, Dialects and the Politics of English Language in Renaissance Writings. She talks about more than just rogue literature in that book, rogue cant in that book. She puts it into conversation with other dialects, which is really interesting. And she talks about its implications for the whole project of literature in the Renaissance. So I really recommend that book. She's a brilliant scholar. She was a brilliant scholar. She unfortunately passed, but that was published by Routledge in 1996. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, I did publish my own book on the topic of roguery. It's not focused on rogue cant, but of course, rogue cant comes up again and again at various junctures in the book. And as I mentioned, it's just came out in softcover this summer. So it's affordable, even though most academic books are not. And so I think you can get it for the low price of $35, which is affordable for an academic book. And if you're interested in this topic, I urge you all to do so.
Yes, absolutely belongs in the library of rogue knowledge for sure. And I will place links to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode. So stay tuned for the URLs for where to find those. And as you know, Ari, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Great. Well, last time I was on the show, I already covered my obsession with pulpy mass fiction. I won't subject your listeners to that again. I will say that since I was on your show last time, I've become more and more interested in the work of John Milton. And so if I could bring any volume with me, I would try to find an excellent volume of the collected works of John Milton. I think that alongside Shakespeare and the Bible, Milton would be a wonderful companion on that desert island. And if because I was on the podcast twice, I get to bring the pulpy crime novels with me too, that honestly, I don't know if I would leave the island if they came looking for me.
That's certainly a good book, and with plenty enough to keep you busy from paradise to pandemonium. You won't be short on company there. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I'm still working on a second book that I mentioned in my first appearance with you, my first conversation. Some research for that book has started to come out this summer in the German Shakespeare Association's annual volume, which is the oldest Shakespeare journal in the world, called Shakespeare Jahrbuch or Shakespeare Yearbook. I have an essay on the Henriade and race, in which I make the argument that one of the characters that in the famous mustering scene named Shadow is very likely an Englishman of mixed race, making him, as far as I know, the only non-white Englishman in Shakespeare's canon. So that's a really interesting piece of my research that's come out recently, piece of the new book. I'm also working right now with colleagues on 2 edited volumes of scholarly essays. One is on Milton and trans studies. Another is on Shakespeare and the concept of life. That's a big concept, but it's part of a series that looks at Shakespeare and sort of large concepts like text or skin or space. And so this one's about Shakespeare and life. We're going to cover biography, but also other ideas about life, including the management of life by the state, and including things like life and religion and stuff like that. So
just a few things to keep you busy.
Just a few things to keep me busy. Yeah, it's good to be busy, as they say.
It sounds like so many exciting things from the world of Ari Friedlander we'll have to look forward to. Thank you so much for being here this week. I've enjoyed this introduction to rogue cant and just the exciting world of all that is roguery and the language here to understand. I appreciate you being here to share this with us.
Well, thank you very much, Cassidy. I really enjoyed coming back on the podcast. I hope to speak to you again.
If you enjoy learning about the life of William Shakespeare and want to go one step further to really try out the history you learn about here on the show, then consider joining Experience Shakespeare. This premium tier on Patreon lets you try out games, recipes, and crafts straight from the life of William Shakespeare. These are all activities you can complete at home or in your classroom. As a special bonus for being a member of Experience Shakespeare, you will also receive access to our exclusive library of virtual tours, animated plays, lesson plans, and history guides, along with discounts on That Shakespeare Life merchandise. Why just learn about Shakespeare's history when you can experience it? If you'd like to dive in and get hands-on with your history, then join us today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and click on Experience Shakespeare. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. Thank you for spending time with us here this week. Every episode is made possible by listeners just like you who are passionate about exploring the life and history of William Shakespeare. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.